every day I feel incredibly fortunate. It's really important to me to welcome people into the house because I learned about architecture from knocking on people's doors. You have a Schindler house, you have a Neutscher house, I'd love to see it. And almost everyone said, sure, come on. I'm happy to share it with you. And that's the kind of owner I want to be. My name is Andrew Romano. This is the Walker House by RM Schindler, 1936, and it's located in Silver Lake in Los Angeles. If there's anywhere in the United States where people really appreciate, specifically modernist design, I feel like it's Los Angeles and this part of Los Angeles. Silver Lake has a long history of bohemianism, leftism, radicalism. I mean, it's one of the birthplaces of the movie industry, the gay rights movement. Artists, musicians have lived here. Obviously, it's a very expensive neighborhood now, unfortunately. To a degree, that's changed. But I do think one of the legacies of that history is that people appreciate the built sort of fabric of the place. If there's anywhere where people aren't gonna come in and knock down a great modernist house, it would be in this area. So it's just a great neighborhood. The Walker House is a 1936 design by RM Schindler, who was sort of a maverick early modernist architect who came from Vienna to the United States to work for Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is sort of a house from Schindler's middle period, the 1930s, where he had established a name for himself here in Los Angeles and started to create maybe a more expansive vision of what his architecture could be. I mean, one thing about this house that he wrote about, in fact, was that it's an example of what you could do on a really steep site. So a lot of modernist architects in LA, their clients were a little more radical, but they didn't have a lot of money. And the sites that they could afford were these ones up in the hills, up on the steep slopes. And Schindler described this house as one that would cascade down the slope as one of his models of how you could build contemporary and modernist house in Los Angeles. You can always tell that it's a Schindler house. There's certain distinctive characteristics that he would bring to it. But more than that, it was a process, it was an approach. So Schindler sort of positioned himself in opposition to the kind of rigorous form follows function, international style modernism, steel and glass, rectilinear, everything sort of perfectly rational. Schindler saw his architecture as a response to the specifics, the site, the light, the client, the conditions, and he would figure out an individual approach to every single project, every single house that was tailored to his clients and to all those other demands that were being put on his design. And I think the result of that was just a kind of personality and individuality in his designs. Some might call it organic design, but it was really just that each of his houses feels like it has its own character that's informed by all those conditions. And I think the Walker House, many others, are a great example of what made Schindler so unique. I've learned a little bit about the original owners. Their names were Ralph Walker and Ola Fern Walker. Ralph Walker was in the medical or health insurance business. I think he was early in sort of part of Blue Cross. So he had a little bit of money. And this part of Silver Lake up on the hill here was what some people have referred to as kind of like a pill hill. It's like where doctors and other professionals, white-collar professionals lived. It's a little bit different than some of the more bohemian parts of Silver Lake. Ola Fern Walker, his wife, was the kind of aesthete of the family. She was the one who was the impetus behind getting Schindler to come in and design the house. So they bought this lot, I think it was $800 in 1934, 35. I think they met him through Ola Walker's ikebana teacher, Japanese flower arranging. That was a big part of her life, apparently. I think she was also into theater and drama. So you really feel sort of her personality, I think, especially in the house. This was a house that I had my eye on, and I knocked on the door and met the owner's daughter. She was here as a kind of caretaker for her mother, who was older. Exchanged emails, asked her to sell it to me. She said she couldn't do that, but that she would let me know if they ever decided to. Her mother passed away, and she sent me an email, and she said, we're gonna sell it. I'm not gonna sell it to you directly, we're gonna put it on the market, but I'm letting you know. So we put our other house up for sale off market, found a buyer who was willing to wait until we found out if we could get this house. It was contingent on us getting this house. So the nicest buyer in the world. And we ended up being the only offer on this house somehow. I still don't know how that happened. because we couldn't have afforded to pay a penny more for it. So we gave them asking price, and I don't know, it was meant to be. I again, feel very, very fortunate that it ended up this way. The pandemic was actually pretty revealing in terms of what it's like to live in this house, because being stuck here made me incredibly grateful for the experience of what being in this space is. It's that we were cut off from the world, but I still felt like I was part of it. It really underscored the connection that this house has to the environment around it. So you're not stuck in a box of a room with a little cutout window. You've got a sort of panorama of hills and mountains and lake and trees, and if you have to be inside, I think it reminded me of why I love this place so much. It's because you're part of the world as well, even when you're in it. And that's very much how Schindler designed the house. It's not as simple as kind of indoor-outdoor flow, because this is on a hillside and sometimes it's kind of hard to get outside. It's the feeling that whenever you're inside, that the outside is part of your experience as well. The way that light is shifting, the way that trees are moving, you're still a part of that. You're not separated from it. And so that's one really beautiful aspect of living here. Another one is, and I've thought a lot about this, it's sort of like what my kids take from growing up here. I grew up in a colonial style home. It was built in like the 1970s in suburban New Jersey, and it was a really nice house. I loved living there, but I can't say that it shaped me in any way. And I'm curious, this environment is so radical, like you think of the house that a kid would draw on with a crayon. It's a square with a triangle on the top. And so that's like what my house looked like growing up. This doesn't look like a house, The experience of living in it, I think, is different. I don't think they're gonna become architects or something because they lived in a Schindler house. But what I love about Schindler is that he was uncompromising, that he believed in what he was doing. He had a certain vision and he pursued that doggedly. And I think his work, his houses are a sort of testament to that persistence, that character, that sort of maverick tendency. And I guess part of me wonders, if you live in a place that's always reinforcing that idea, that you can do things differently, you can do things your own way, do kids absorb some of that? I don't know. I hope so. There's a rhythm to architecture. You move through it. It's not a static thing. That experience of moving through a space from one space to another and taking in what's outside as well as inside at the same time. I'm not an architect, I'm not a designer. I didn't really know anything about Schindler the first time I walked into one of his houses, but that experience was for me an epiphany, because I felt like I was surrounded by the ideas, the sort of concepts of an artist. That I was having this experience where I'm like, oh, why did he make that decision? Why is this here? And it was just incredibly enriching. And every day that I live here, that experience continues. That feeling of it's alive, you're moving through it, you're living, you're sort of tracing the arc of your day through the space that he had sort of laid out so long ago, with the idea of how people live in it in mind. I feel very fortunate, a lot of gratitude that I'm able to live in this space. And so it's important to me that people experience that, because I feel like I owe it to Schindler that he's still underappreciated. The more that you can kind of invite people into that experience, the more people will realize what he was trying to do. 100 years ago, he started doing this. And even today, I think we haven't sort of fully caught up to it. Schindler, more than almost any other architect I can think of, you need to be in his spaces to understand them. When he talked about his architecture, he described it as space architecture. Now, not outer space, but actually the spatial experience of being inside one of his designs. And it really was dictated by that experience of being inside. So the exterior look of his houses, he was concerned with that, but that sort of flowed from how his interior spaces fit together. And that's really what he was concerned with. Even in photographs, you can't really understand what it feels like to be in the space. And I think that hampered sort of his own reputation in his lifetime. It's part of the reason why it's so important to me as the steward of this house to try to open my doors to people whenever possible, because I feel like Schindler is much cooler now than he was, you know, when he died in 1953. Still, I think he's not as appreciated as an architect as he should be. And I think the more that people can experience his spaces, I feel like I owe it to Schindler to let people have that experience, because I think until you do, you can't fully grasp what he was going for.